Cold. Arrival. Montana Territory. Late winter of 1884. The wind came like a thin saw through the canyon, gnawing at wood and bone. I was standing in the mouth of my forge, the coals dying to a red hush, when the stage rattled in and hissed steam like a beast that had crawled too far for too long. Snow wasn't falling so much as drifting sidewise in hard little needles, and every boot on the platform sounded hollow, as if the boards themselves were tired of the weight of folks' hopes. A young woman stepped down last, careful with her footing. She had a carpet bag and, God help her, 2 babies pressed to her in a sling that made her look smaller than the cold already had. You learn things on a frontier street in the time it takes a man to fix his hat. Who's got a bill to dodge, who's carrying a sorrow he won't set down, who is brave because there's no other way to keep living. This girl, no. Woman had all 3 braided together across her face like winter lines in old pine. The snow found the thin in her coat. One of the twins whimpered. She looked down, kissed a little brow, and stood there on the platform, as if the simple act of standing might summon the life she'd been promised in letters. That's when Silas Mercer, black gloves, city collar, a habit of looking past people, strode up with his sister Agnes, like a second shadow. He tipped his hat halfway, enough for onlookers, not enough for decency. His eyes dropped to the babies. All the warmth in him, what little I'd ever seen, drained out like spill from a cracked keg. He said something I couldn't hear over the wind. Her answer lowered, then stiffened. I caught the last pieces when the gust thinned. I wrote, she said, voice shaking but unbroken, 6 letters. I told you I had twins. I told you everything. Silas's mouth went slant. You didn't tell me what matters. I don't much care for the part of myself that listens for a fight. But there it is. A man doesn't leave the badge behind in his bones just because he took it off the belt. I stepped out into the white grit and walked toward the stage. Folks were already peeking through saloon doors. The world's always got time for a bit of someone else's ruin. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway, to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Afternoon, I said, simple as a fence post. I set myself between the wind and the woman, took off my hat to the babies first out of habit. I always figured respect ought to start with the small and then to her. Name's Jonah Rourke. Ma'am, you look like you could use a stove and a chair. Silas turned my way. He had that storekeeper smile on, the one he saves for when he's deciding whether a man is money. Jonah, he said, this is a private matter. There. It became public the minute you brought your manners out in the open, I told him, and let him hear the iron in it. I didn't raise my voice. The wind carried truth just fine. Agnes hissed air. She's been president of the ladies' circle since the silver boom, wrapped her righteousness in lace. It's indecent, she said, meaning the babies, meaning the woman's need, meaning anything that didn't ask her permission to exist. One of the twins started crying. The sound cut through me like it always does. My little girl used to cry like that when fever came in the night. You can know a thing is dead and still hear it call you from a room you can't open anymore. The woman shifted her weight. Her face was pale with travel and hunger, but the eyes hazel, steady held. Thank you, Mr. Rourke, she said. But Mr. Mercer has offered 2 nights at the hotel. After that, she stopped. After that, Silas said, isn't my concern. Oh, you used ink to make a promise, I told him. Ink's cheap to a man who doesn't pay in anything else. Color rose in his cheeks. He glanced down the platform at the faces that had turned. A few miners had come up from the creek. Ella from the boarding house was watching, hands to her apron. Old Reverend Pike stood with his coat unlatching itself because he forgets buttons when he's angry. I won't raise another man's children, Silas said finally, as if he were donating honesty to the poor. That's good, I said, because you won't be asked. I turned to the woman. Ma'am, Clara Evans, she said. These are Lily and Tom. Miss Evans, I said, giving the name the weight it deserved. My forge is 20 steps that way. It's warm. There's tea that tastes like wire, but it's hot and honest. You can sit. If you don't like the look of me, Ella's boarding house will open a corner by the stove until we set things right. Either way, you won't stand here on mercy that ain't coming. Oh. She looked past me at the black mouth of my shop, at the little window with its soot halo, at the anvil that had taken more of my days than sleep had. She looked at her babies, and then at Silas one last time, as if to write an ending that might be less cruel. When he looked away first, the last of her waiting died without ceremony. "Thank you," she said. The words trembled, but the chin didn't. I would be grateful for warmth. I moved to lift the carpet bag. She didn't let go, not fully. I respected that. Some things a person has to carry themselves for a few more feet, or they don't know who they are anymore. So I took the other end. Inside the forge, the air hit her like bread. Heat climbed from the bricks. I threw a split pitch knot on the coals, and the flames shouldered up, big and blue at the heart. "Sit there," I said, nodding to the stool I keep for customers who can't stand their boots. I filled the kettle and set it on the rim. "You eatin'?" She shook her head, like she was embarrassed to admit hunger. "I cut hardtack and beef. I'd smoked myself. Not because it tastes like much, but because you can chew and remember you're alive." She tried to say, "No thank you," because sorrowed folks always think they shouldn't cost you anything. I put the plate in her hand. "Eat," I said, that same voice I used to save for colts and dying men. "That's an order." Lily, small and fierce, settled first, cheek on her mother's collarbone. Tom kept crying, thin and close to quitting, the kind of cry that says fever's sniffing around. I touched his forehead with the back of my knuckles. "Hot. May I?" I asked, already reaching for my drawer of odds and ends, the place where blacksmith work ends and old deputy habits begin. "You know medicine?" she asked, cautious hope in it. "Some," I said. "Not enough to brag about. Enough to get a man through the night and into a doctor's hands in the morning." "Ode?" I set water to cool in a tin cup, dug out a folded cloth, a dropper, a bit of willow bark tincture I'd traded for when Benton's wagon came through. I cooled Tom's face, let a breath of winter air in through the back. Just a crack, enough to wake his lungs. He quieted under the rhythm. Babies like rhythm. It tells them somebody older than time is around. Clara watched me like a person watches a stranger who might also be a bridge. "I told him," she said softly, not looking at Silas anymore because we'd left him outside where he belonged. "I wrote in my second letter, and the fourth. He said he wanted a family." She stopped, swallowed. "I suppose he meant one he could pose in a window." "Some men want seasons," I said. "They rent spring for the look of flowers and send winter to the neighbor." The kettle began to complain. I poured tea and watched her hand. They shook when she lifted the cup but steadied on the second sip. Lily slept. Tom's breathing evened. The forge talked to itself in pops. It was the best sound I knew. "You from back east?" I asked. "Pittsburgh." She nodded toward the twins. "Their father worked at a mill. He died. There were debts. A notice in the paper. Then letters. Then miles." "I'm sorry," I said. 2 words, no decoration. "You don't gild a grave." She nodded like the words hit where they were meant to. "I can read and keep accounts," she added, as if we were interviewing and she had to earn the warmth. "I can teach. I don't want charity." "You won't get any in Greywater," I said. "We ain't rich enough for charity. Only trade. You need something. You pay in work or dignity. Dignity's worth more. Most folks don't have any to spare." Something like a smile touched the corner of her mouth. It looked surprised to be there. A shadow hesitated at my doorway. I didn't have to look to know the shape. Silas filled a place like a bad smell fills a parlor, polite, insistent, meant to be ignored but never quite can. "She'll be at the hotel for 2 nights, he said, not coming in. "After that, I expect she'll be on her way." I stood. "After that," I said, "you won't trouble yourself to think about it, and that'll be the most honest thing you've done here today." His jaw worked, but the forge light was behind me, and I'm not a small man. He took the safer step, the one that leads away. When he'd gone, Clara let out the breath she'd been holding since the platform. "You don't have to put yourself between me and him," she said. "I'm not," I told her. "I'm putting heat between you and the cold. He just happens to be standing with the cold." I showed her the little room off the back where I kept a cot for times when the mountain caught me far from home. It had a window that faced the alley and a quilt I'd never thrown away because old women's stitches are the last true map of town. "You can rest here an hour," I said. "Then Ella will have a corner by her stove. You'll not be at the hotel. I won't set you in the mouth of that place for 2 nights of whispers. Her eyes flashed. Mr. Rourke Jonah, she corrected herself, almost smiling at the clumsiness of names between strangers. You don't even know me. Oh, I know what the wind looked like on your face at the platform, I said. I know that a woman who holds 2 babies through a winter stage has already done 3 days' worth of work before breakfast. That's enough for me to open a door. After that, you can tell me who you are, if you like. Or you can keep it for later. She stood there with her babies, and a plate with crumbs, and the steam of cheap tea curling up like a blessing nobody claimed. I'll take an hour, she said. Then I'll pay you back with whatever you need done. All right, I said, because pride needs just one safe place to stand to stop being a drowning thing. We'll call it square when your boy's fever comes down. I stepped outside to give them quiet. Snow had thinned to an honest gray. Across the street, the saloon had lost interest in our little play. The anvil was cold, but I had iron to heat, and iron in me besides. I set to work and let the hammer talk a while. It spoke in the only grammar I've trusted, effort and echo. An hour later, the children had slept. Clara had, too, in that wary half-sleep that mothers do. I walked them up to Ella's. The boarding house smelled of stew and soap. Ella didn't blink, just opened her arms wide enough to take in 3 people at once. Back room, she said to me without asking what we were about. By the stove. Agnes can come try my biscuits if she wants to monitor propriety. I paid 3 days in advance. Ella glanced at the coins and at my face and put the money in a jar. Nobody robs because they know she'd hunt them to the county line and back with a spoon. She's safe, Ella said. Then quieter. You sure you want to set yourself in front of Mercer this way? I didn't set myself anywhere, I said. The road was just there. I stepped outside into late afternoon. Greywater Crossing had that hour where the light goes thin and blue. It makes you think of all the times you didn't say the thing that might have saved somebody. I headed back to my forge and kept the door open so the town could see I was there if anybody needed steel or something heavier. Loneliness is a habit. So is watchfulness. Out here they look the same until somebody smaller than you leans their life on it. That night, the baby's fever broke and rose again. The way fevers do when they're deciding whether the living is worth the trouble. I brought Willow and a clean cloth and milk warmed careful. I told Ella what to look for, breath hitching, eyes rolling, the small silence between cries that says the body's getting too tired to cry right. She talked back to me like I was her second husband, and she liked me better than her first. It was enough. Around midnight I stepped into the alley for air. Above the roofs, the stars were sharp as filings. Somewhere down by the creek, a dog argued with the idea of moonlight. I leaned against cold brick and let the past sit beside me. When my little one died, I watched the window for a kind of dawn that didn't come. I had carried the blame around like a hot nail in my pocket, so long I forgot I could set it down on an anvil and flatten it into something that wouldn't burn. I didn't make any oaths to God or myself. I just decided what a man decides in winter. I would see Clara Evans and those babies through to ground that wasn't made of ice and strangers. And that, in a town like ours, is how wars start, and families too. Wires and whispers. Morning in Greywater Crossing smelled like coal smoke and last night's decisions. Frost lay on the hitch posts, thin as regret, and the bell over Mercer's Emporium rang too early for anyone's liking. I was already at the forge, door wide to let the heat breathe. Snow shoveled off the stoop, with a blade worn to a whisper of iron. The anvil sang when struck a low, steady hymn that kept my thoughts from wandering into places best left shut. By 9, Reverend Pike poked his head in like a prairie dog testing for hawks. His spectacles fogged from the heat. "You took the woman and her twins to Ella's," he said. "Not a question." "I did." He sighed, his breath clouding like sermon smoke. "Mercer's been in my ear since dawn. Says the ladies' circle will raise a moral complaint if we don't regulate certain arrangements." "Moral men do less regulating and more delivering of wood," I said, tossing him my spare gloves. "You came to warn me or recruit me?" "Warn," he said. "And to bring this." He set a parcel on my workbench. "Baby shirts. My Martha stitched half the night. Thought maybe they'd fit." I took the bundle like it was made of glass. Men like me don't do well with kindness. It bruises easier than iron. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender and chimney soot, domestic things, impossible things. Pike nodded once and left, boots creaking through snow that squealed like teeth on tin. The morning stretched long. I sharpened 2 plow blades till they shone like promises, ring-welded a hitch, convinced a stubborn stove leg that standing straight was godly work. Every clang sent sparks across the floor, bright and short-lived little arguments with the dark. When the bellows hissed, it sounded like the world exhaling. Outside, Greywater Crossing woke slow. The freight line coughed steam, horses stomped in the chill, and the tavern dumped last night's ashes into the street. A town held together by splinters and habit. We like to think ourselves civilized just because we'd put glass in a few windows. But civility out here was measured by how quick a man shared his shovel, not by the sermons he swallowed. By midday, the forge smelled of sweat and cedar oil. I packed stew into a tin for Ella's place, meaning to drop it off before the light failed. Just as I swung the door open, a figure blocked the frame. Agnes Mercer, her hat pinned sharp enough to nail a sermon to a tree. The snow around her boots hadn't dared melt. "Mr. Rourke," she said, voice clipped as cold wire, "we're forming a committee." "You've always been good at committees," I said. "Ever tried forming a meal?" Color rose in her cheeks, the first sign of life she'd shown since Lent. "That woman is under your protection." "She's under a roof and near a stove," I said. "Protection belongs to everyone who breathes in a town that calls itself decent." Her mouth tightened to a blade. "Then see that decency is kept. A mother with infants should not be visiting a bachelor's forge." "Tell the weather," I said. "It seems to visit everyone uninvited." Agnes left stiff-spined, footprints neat as ledger lines. Behind her, the world went back to the business of pretending it wasn't cruel. At Ella's boarding house, the smell of broth met me halfway up the steps. Inside, Clara sat near the stove, one child drowsing against her shoulder, the other staring at the fire as if she'd discovered God hiding in it. Ella wiped her hands on her apron and nodded at me. "Fever's down," she said. "Whatever you brewed, it ain't poison." "High praise," I said, setting the tin on the table. Clara looked up. The travel hollow of her face had softened. Hunger and fear had stepped back far enough for courage to be seen again. She had the look of someone relearning the weight of hope. "I heard there's a schoolhouse that needs ledgers kept," she said. "I can do figures. We'll find you something honest and steady," I told her. "But for today, eat and sit. I'd like to earn my keep." "You are," I said, nodding toward the twins. "That's 2 apprentices you're training. Town's lucky." She smiled, brief but real, a sunrise that didn't quite believe in itself yet. Then the door banged open. Silas Mercer's clerk stood there, hat crushed between nervous hands, eyes skittering like mice. "Mr. Rourke," he stammered. "Mr. Mercer wants a word. Private. Anything he's got to say, he can say in front of folks who can read his face while he's saying it." I brushed past him into the street, to make sure he understood I wasn't about to beg for a corner in Mercer's ledger. Silas waited by his storefront, boots clean of our mud, coat immaculate enough to shame a preacher. "You like to make scenes," he said. "I like to end them," I said. "We done?" He leaned close, breath rich with imported coffee. "You take her in, her and her brats. You'll find the council unwelcoming. Licenses get hard to renew. Coal gets late. Ore buyers skip town. The world's a web, Rourke, and I hold a wire or two." I let my jaw go still. "Here's a wire you don't hold," I said. "If you so much as lean on Ella for giving a woman heat, I'll walk your ledgers to the sheriff and the circuit judge, and we'll talk about those missing crates that come through at night smelling more like whiskey than kerosene." His smile died slow, like a candle under glass. "Rumors. Numbers," I said. "And numbers don't gossip, they testify." For a long breath, only the snow dared move between us. Then he stepped back, reassessing the cost of righteousness against the price of being caught. "She'll be trouble," he said. "She'll be a neighbor," I said. By evening, the wind shifted, a warning whispered down from Alder Pass. I could smell the storm before I saw it, that dry metallic tang that means snow and something worse. I hauled extra wood to Ella's, checked the sand buckets in my forge. A town like ours was tinder waiting for its match. You learn to sleep with your boots on. Midnight came hissing through the cracks. The gale clawed at the eaves like a thief testing locks, then yelling. A flash of orange behind Mercer's Emporium, small, hungry, growing fast. "Bucket line," I shouted, my voice lost in the storm. "Bucket Ella, keep the babies." Men and women spilled from doorways, half-dressed, half awake, all scared. Snow met fire and screamed. The orange doubled, leaping from crate to crate like it had been waiting for a chance to speak its piece. Clara was there, of course. She was babies safe with Ella, skirts pinned high, hair braided back, face set like a wheel in a rut. "Where?" she asked, already grabbing a bucket. "Back corridor," I said, and we ran into the heat. If you've never fought fire in a wind, you can't know how fast a town can turn to memory. The alley pulled the blaze through it like a trumpet. We ducked, hauled, cursed, passed buckets hand to hand till our palms went raw. Water turned to steam in our faces and back to ice on our coats. Reverend Pike stumbled past carrying a barrel and swore he'd never bless whiskey again. Then came a sound that cut through everything, thin, high, awful. A child. Inside. I don't remember thinking, just moving. Clara moved with me. "Jonah," she started. "Stay with the line." "Like hell," she said, and followed. "Smoke is a liar and a Democrat. It steals from rich and poor the same." We went low, crawling through the side door. The storeroom breathed fire and panic. The cry again left corner, under a fallen crate. Mercer's sister sometimes kept her boy there when she worked late. I heaved the crate aside. Clara crawled under, lifted the child, a boy, maybe 4, wrapped his face in her damp shawl. We staggered out together, the world bending and bellowing around us. Fresh air hit like knives. Outside, the bucket line cheered like we'd dragged spring out of the flames. The boy coughed once, then wailed pure music. "Get him to Martha Pike," Clara gasped. "I'll douse the back shelf." "You're not." "I am. There are orders you give. And then there are ones you swallow because the person you'd give them to already outranks your courage." I carried the boy to Martha, who smothered him in blankets and prayer, then turned back. Clara and Ella were flanking the shelf, throwing water like saints with buckets instead of halos. The fire faltered, flared once more, then shrank. The wind shifted, merciful for once, and the blaze lost its appetite. By dawn, the alley was a black tongue lolling from Mercer's back door. Half his stock was wet ash, the other half would sell for pennies in spite. Folks drifted home, burned but grateful. Reverend Pike shook my shoulder, soot-streaked grin wide. "You and that woman," he said. "You made the difference." I found Clara on the steps, wrapped in Ella's shawl, hair singed at the ends, eyes bright with something too alive for sleep. The twins were safe, fussy, alive, proof that mercy sometimes wears borrowed boots. "You don't follow orders well," I said. "I follow the work," she said. "So do you." We looked at each other like two mules who'd pulled the same hill and finally reached the crest. Across the street, Mercer stepped out into his ruin. His coat was still neat, but his face wasn't. He looked at the charred timbers, then at the boy wrapped in Pike's blanket. He opened his mouth, closed it. For once, the man of ledgers had no numbers for what he felt. "Clara," I said quietly as sunlight found its courage, "you'll stay at Ella's another week. On me. After that, if you want, you and the twins can move into the rooms above my forge. 2 doors, 1 lock each. I won't so much as breathe on a hinge without your say. Work mornings with me books, orders. Afternoons, teach letters at the church hall. Evenings, you rest. No charity, trade." She stared like I'd offered a map to some place she'd thought didn't exist. "Why?" she asked finally. "Because I've seen what happens to towns that spit out mothers in the snow," I said. "They turn to ghosts before the year's out." Clara looked down at the twins, then at the smoke ribboning up the dawn sky. When she met my eyes again, there was steadiness there, the kind that holds. "I'll pay rent," she said. "Honest and on time." "You will," I said, "and I'll take it." That night, Greywater Crossing slept like a dog finally allowed inside. The snow stopped. The wind, spent from its tantrum, went somewhere else to complain. I stayed awake, fixing a hinge that hadn't asked for it, listening to the house settle and the faint breath of 2 new lives across town. Somewhere between hammer blows, I realized I was thinking not about the fire we'd beaten, but about the warmth it left behind. Kindness is dangerous work. It makes you remember what you've lost, and worse, it makes you imagine what could still be found. 2 rooms, 2 locks. A town may be learning how to be decent, 1 bucket of water at a time. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The council and the debt. The council met on Thursdays, which meant the whole town spent Wednesdays rehearsing righteousness. You could hear it warming up like a brass band, rumors tuning, gossip clinking in teacups, the scratch of quills on complaint letters no one would read. The wind carried bits of it down Canyon Street, mixing with the smell of coal and bread dough, and something human you couldn't name until you'd lived here long enough. The sound of people trying to believe they still mattered. Agnes Mercer pinned new notices on the church fence, "Propriety and Commerce," in capital letters fit for commandments. Reverend Pike worked on a sermon about mercy that was trying hard to wear boots, but still tripped on its hem. And Silas Mercer himself wore a face that said, "I, too, have suffered," and it nearly fooled his own mirror. That same morning, Clara moved into the rooms above my forge. 2 rooms, 2 locks, as promised. I'd planed the window frames smooth myself, nailed the floorboards tight enough that even ghosts would have to tiptoe. She paid the week in advance, her coins stacked neat as truth on my workbench. I told her she didn't need to, but she said she slept better when the numbers matched. I tried not to notice how Lily's laugh filled the space I'd kept empty on purpose. It floated down through the floorboards, bright and reckless, mixing with the ring of hammer on steel, until I couldn't tell which sound belonged to me. Tom followed me everywhere that day, fists around a wooden mallet I'd carved him, pretending to forge nails out of sunlight. Every time he struck the anvil, it sang one pure note, Hope's clumsy apprentice. By noon, the wind had changed. A pair of strangers came up Canyon Street, the kind of men whose boots never learned mud. Their coats were too fine for the weather, city wool that whispered money every time they moved. They looked around like undertakers estimating a coffin. They found Mercer outside his store, counting the silence between customers. He tried to stand taller than them and somehow managed to shrink. I watched from my doorway. You don't need ears to know when a deal's being made, the faces do the talking. One hand passed a paper, another a purse. The air itself changed temperature, the way it does when a storm decides which way to go. That evening, Clara and I worked the ledgers by lamplight. She wrote numbers like prayers, each stroke deliberate, unafraid to end. The lamp threw our shadows long against the wall, mine thick at the shoulders, hers small and steady, the outline of a woman holding the world together with ink and willpower. "You've forgiven old Miller twice," she said, brows knitting like 2 ravens deciding which way the wind blows. "He brings me stories of the river," I said. "I charge him in yarn." "Stories don't buy coal." "They do," I said, "if you listen long enough." She shook her head but smiled. Her smile was never wide, it just settled gently, like sunlight finding a window it hadn't touched in years. A knock cut through the warmth. Ella stood in the doorway, cheeks red, apron still smoking from the stove. "Trouble," she said, "down at Pike's." We went fast. The church hall smelled of wax and wet wool. 2 men in city coats stood inside, boots untouched by dust, badges that weren't ours glinting under the lanterns. One held papers fat with seals. The other had a mouth that looked accustomed to closing deals for other men's profit. "We represent certain Eastern investors," the tall one began. His voice had the polite cruelty of polished oak. "Debts associated with Mr. Mercer's shipments have matured. By extension, liens attached to properties pledged informally." "Informally," Pike repeated, rolling the word on his tongue. "That's a good word for sin in a suit." The shorter one's eyes found me. "Your forge," he said, "was used to crate unregistered goods for night wagons." "That so?" I asked, quiet. Quiet as how you handle a skittish horse and men who think they're the rider. "I hammer iron. I don't bless what men bolt to it." He unfolded his paper with ceremony. You'll vacate by morning pending investigation. Behind me, I heard Clara's breath catch, but she didn't flinch. Tom and Lily will sleep at Ella's, she said, already planning aloud. We'll be ready. Like hell you will, I said. Nobody's taking a roof from babies on my watch. I walked the men out into the blue cold. The street lamps flickered, snow whispering against the boardwalk. Here's what you'll do, I told them. You'll go back to your hotel and wire your bosses for clearer orders, because the sheriff who owes me one and has a memory like Winter will want a name to pin this to. If that name rhymes with Mercer, your friends will have frost on their eyebrows before spring. The taller man's smile was paper thin. We collect, that's all. You collect what you can carry, I said. Try me. They went. Not far, not fast, but they went. When I turned back, Clara stood beside me in the street, the lamplight trembling on her shawl. You can't fight paper with a hammer, she said. I can fight the hand holding the paper. She reached out, laid a hand on my sleeve cloth. Bone, steadiness. Don't go alone. I didn't. Word travels quicker than wind in small towns. Pike came, coat half-buttoned and eyes bright with mischief. Ella brought her rolling pin like it was a holy relic. Even old Miller shuffled along behind us, muttering river curses he swore were biblical if you pronounced them right. We cornered Mercer in his back office, where the lamplight made his gold pen look guilty. He was drinking tea, the kind of tea men drink when they hope steam can wash away arithmetic. They came for my forge, I said, my rooms, my tenants. Collateral, he answered, trying to stand on a word his boots couldn't reach. You've always thought commerce was a sin. Well, here's your grace. I'll speak to them. Placate, defer, keep out of it. You bring men to take beds from babies, I said. Then you ask me to keep out. He looked past me toward Clara, mistaking silence for weakness. Madam, he said, aiming for gentility, landing square in grime. I miscalculated. The letters were mislaid. But this town cannot hold you, and your complications without cost. Clara's voice came level as the edge of winter. My children are not complications. They're the only honest arithmetic I've done. Mercer's lips thinned to a line of ledgers. If you were to marry, propriety would— I already have a guardian, she said, and for a half-breath I thought she'd say my name. Instead she said, myself. Pike laughed one sharp bark of joy. Hear that, Agnes? We've got a doctrine I can finally preach. Mercer flushed the color of cold bacon grease. You'll regret this insolence. Only if I start respecting arithmetic more than decency, she said. That night, the snow quit pretending to be gentle. It came down thick and sideways, burying tracks faster than we could make them. Around midnight, the city men tried my back door. I'd been waiting. The forge glowed low behind me, iron smell heavy in the air. I don't carry a badge anymore, I told them, but I still own the stance. Step across that threshold, and I'll introduce your shins to a truth older than your bosses, the law of weight and leverage. They froze, measuring the odds. Somewhere out on the tracks, a coyote laughed, the kind of sound that convinces cowards to choose discretion. They left. I watched till their lanterns shrank to sparks and died in the snow. Morning brought blue sky so clear it hurt. Smoke rose from every chimney. The town had survived another rumor. But the council was set to meet, and meetings mean war in slow motion. By noon the church hall was full, men in wool, women in starch, the children wide-eyed at the spectacle of grown-ups trying to remember decency. Agnes arranged her notes like a general laying out maps. The city men stood at her side, all badges and polish. Mercer sat at the front, pale as flour, hands folded as if prayer could be collateral. Pike opened with a verse about truth and boots, then let the floor to the visitors. They unrolled their papers. Agnes unrolled her speech. Mercer unrolled the kind of suffering that sells well by the yard. The words clattered around the hall like coins dropped down a well. Finally, Pike raised a hand. You've had your say, he told them. Now maybe we hear from the man whose roof you're trying to take. I hate talking to rooms. Words should earn their keep, but I stepped up anyway, because silence is the luxury of the unthreatened. I ain't much for speeches, I began. I build things that don't argue, but I've seen what passes through this town at night, crates that don't meet the morning, wagons that don't pay their share of dust. I've seen ledgers bend truth till it breaks, and I've seen a mother trying to raise 2 children in a place that claims to be decent. You can't fix the first without protecting the last." A murmur moved through the crowd, restless as dry wheat. Mercer tried to interrupt, but Pike's cane hit the floor like a gavel. Then Clara, without asking permission, because women who've survived enough stopped doing that, stepped forward. She held a ledger against her chest. "This," she said, "is Mr. Mercer's arithmetic, and this is mine." She opened the book. 2 columns. One neat, one sneaky. She pointed where interest turned to theft, where night wagons became numbers that never existed. Her hand didn't shake. The hall went silent, that deep silence before an avalanche decides to move. Mercer stammered, words crumbling like plaster. The city men looked at each other and smiled the way wolves smile when one of their own limps. Pike leaned back, satisfied. "Seems the Lord's math still balances," he said. The vote went how votes go when truth finally puts on its boots. The liens would be reviewed by the circuit judge. My forge would stand. The council created a relief fund for winter mothers with children. Agnes looked like a cake left out in the rain, soggy righteousness melting by the minute. Mercer looked older by a decade he hadn't earned. Afterward, in the doorway where the cold made everyone honest, Clara said quietly, "You stood for me, for us." "I stood for my town," I answered. "Because a man needs to pretend his heart isn't the whole map." She smiled faintly. "You said us, and you meant it." Outside, the wind had stopped sawing for once. The snow glittered like something the world might keep. I hadn't planned to say anything more, but some silences deserve breaking. "When my little girl died," I said, "I built a house out of quiet. It was strong, and it was empty. Then you came off that platform with winter on your face, and the house didn't feel right anymore." Her hand found my sleeve again, same gesture, same weight as the night before. "I don't know what comes next," she said, "but I know I'm not running." "Good," I said. "I'm too old to chase." We stood there in the honest blue morning, a blacksmith whose hands knew iron, and a woman whose hands knew every softer thing that keeps a town alive. Behind us, Lily laughed, high and fearless. Tom answered with a burp proud enough for scripture. Reverend Pike called it a miracle. I called it Sunday music. For once, Greywater Crossing sounded like a place worth staying, and that, out here, is the nearest thing to grace. The meeting didn't end in the hall. Meetings never do. They spill into the street and into doorways, into kitchens and over fences, until the talk either wears itself out or gets put to work. Agnes cornered Pike by the woodpile and demanded a committee for the relief fund with rules against abuses. Pike said the only abuse would be stinginess. Agnes sniffed, which in her language meant she'd donate quietly by week's end. The city men didn't ride out. They lingered at the hotel like splinters. After dark, I saw their silhouettes in the telegraph office, messages chattering east like nervous teeth. The operator, young Henley, with a skull full of brass and romance, met me with a look that asked, should I be brave? I told him to send what he must and keep a copy of what he shouldn't. Henley slid a carbon under the counter. Just in case justice needs stationery, he said. Next morning, a brown paper parcel showed at the forge with no return. Inside lay a bottle of rye and a note. To Mr. Rourke, be reasonable. Cash follows. I poured the rye on the ash heap and used the note to start the morning fire. Reasonable heat is all I wanted. Clara's arithmetic became the town's backbone. She gathered the storekeepers after supper in the church hall and taught them how to copy ledgers clean, to write each promise where it could be found by the person who made it. If you won't sign a thing, she told them, you shouldn't sell it. And if you won't read a thing, don't buy it. The men shifted and scuffed, and then nodded like pupils caught cheating by a teacher who'd rather they learn than be punished. Agnes attended at the door and corrected pen grips with military tenderness. 2 days later, the city men tried a softer angle. They came to Ella's in their best voices, ordered pie, and spoke of temporary arrangements. One of them, a blond fellow whose eyes had never been refused, said to Clara, "We can make this go away in a day if you sign a statement that you misread the columns." Clara met his gaze the way the ridge meets wind. "Then it will go away wrong," she said, and resumed cutting pie into honest triangles. That same afternoon, I found a coil of fuse tucked under the alley snow by the forge wall. It was the short kind a man uses when he wants speed more than thought. I held it to the light and felt old habits climb my spine. I didn't say a word, just carried the coil to the sheriff's office and set it on his desk. He set down his coffee and studied it like a poisonous snake, deciding whether to convert. "Night watch?" he asked. "I'll take south," I said. "I'll take north," he said, which in our language meant we will be seen. We weren't alone. Ella put a bucket by her stoop without comment. Miller napped upright with a pitchfork, claiming he guarded dreams. Pike stood in his doorway reading the Psalms aloud like a man swearing at the dark in polite company. Agnes, after much flapping, placed a lantern in her front window and turned the flame high. If a town intends to be decent, it must declare it where cowards can hear. The circuit judge came 10 days later with a deputy, a traveling desk that folded like origami, and a hat wide enough to shade a verdict. He sat up in Pike's hall and called it court in that tone that makes planks behave. For 2 days, the town flowed through that room, teamsters and seamstresses, miners, drovers, 3 adolescents who wanted to watch justice sweat. The city men produced contracts written small and fast. The judge read them slow and twice. "Fine print is still print," he said, "but not when it hides crimes with arithmetic." Clara spoke last, just 3 pages and a pen that never scratched. She showed how numbers had been bent across shipments that never arrived, interest applied twice to debts paid once, and a trick line where overland transit fees equaled 3 men's wages and the patience of a saint. Mercer, to his credit, did not lie well. He swallowed and said he'd signed what had been put before him by men with better boots. The judge asked him if his pen had a conscience. Mercer said not yet, but he was shopping. In the end, the judge struck the liens with a phrase that sounded like a door deciding to stay shut. He fined Mercer a sum that could be paid in mercy if coin ran short, half to the school, half to the relief fund. He told the city men they were welcome to trade honest and unwelcome otherwise. Then he folded his desk and drank Pike's coffee like it had stood as witness. We walked out into a noon bright enough to argue with memory. Folks shook hands they'd cursed the week before. The deputy tipped his hat to Clara. The judge tipped his hat to everyone. Justice, when it's done right, makes people taller without adding inches. That night the town held a supper not quite called a celebration. Music happened despite itself. Henley brought a fiddle that remembered 2 tunes and forgave the rest. The babies clapped at random intervals, which improved the rhythm. Ella's stew tasted like surrender in all the good ways. Even Agnes permitted herself half a laugh and a full slice of pie. Mercer came late and stood at the edge, hat in hands. He looked like a man who'd found his reflection and asked for its name. He raised a cup, not toward me, but toward Clara. She inclined her head and did not smile. Forgiveness is a road with milestones. You don't skip ahead just because the weather's fine. In the days after, money started to move along cleaner channels. The telegraph clicks sounded less like panic and more like trade. Men brought me work without stories grafted to it. I hammered wagon rims, stove doors, 24 nails for Henley's fence, and a small cross of iron for a grave without a stone. Clara expanded her school to include night lessons, figures for mothers, letters for fathers, dignity for anyone who came with hands washed and eyes open. Pay in coin, she'd say, or in courtesy. Both spend. Love. On the 3rd evening, as dusk uncoupled the day from its chores, I found a folded paper tucked under our latch. No signature, just a sentence. I was wrong about you and the woman. Beside it lay a leather pouch of rough opals, mine tailings. Agnes's nephew had been hoarding against a fortune that never learned his name. The pouch was addressed to the Relief for Winter Mothers. I knocked at Agnes's door and held the note. She took it without looking up. "It is unseemly," she said, "to be wrong in public." I told her it was holy to be right at the end. She didn't answer, which is Agnes for amen. The last trouble arrived with a whisper, which is how the worst ones walk. The city men had one more card, a telegram from some eastern office threatening to blacklist Greywater Crossing from certain freight lines. "Commerce requires confidence," it said, as if decency were bad for business. I carried the telegram to the judge's deputy, who smiled like a man remembering a joke he planned to share later. "That office," he said, "owes the territory more than it wants the territory to know." He wired back 5 words, "Proceed, and we proceed likewise." The reply came in under an hour. "Misunderstanding. Regards to the school. Commerce, it turns out, respects confidence when it is backed by backbone. Winter mothers bought coal for half price, the other half paid by the fund and whatever mercy the town could be conned into. We kept a ledger of giving that never balanced, which is how you know it's honest." Clara wrote the names in a tidy hand and then closed the book so no one could count the favors they were owed. Weeks later, when the sky remembered how to be blue without rehearsing, I caught Clara on the stairs listening to Lily laugh and Tom narrate the universe to his boots. "You look like a woman watching a miracle misbehave," I said. "I'm learning to let miracles track mud," she answered. We still had bad days. A stove backfired and singed my beard. The twins learned to argue with vowels. A hen took offense at Tom's morality and pecked him into philosophy. The city men disappeared, then reappeared on a freight car headed east, smaller than they'd arrived and almost human. Mercer learned to count repentance in acts he paid for a church window, and then sat under it where the light could scold him. Agnes retired 2 of the harsher notices and replaced them with one that said simply, "Mind your hands and mind your mouth," which, in the language of fence posts and hymns, is proper doctrine. Sometimes, late, the creek spoke in the voice it uses for people who have stayed. I'd stand in the doorway with the lamp low and watch the street. The town would be sleeping like a tired dog, twitching now and again with dreams of cattle and Sunday shoes. Clara would come up behind me, lay her hand where my shoulder's old hurt lies, and ask, "Is it holding?" "It is," I'd say. "We are." Because after all the papers and speeches, after the ballots and the boots, what kept Greywater Crossing upright wasn't the gavel or the gun. It was a woman with a ledger who refused to bow, a preacher who let mercy wear work clothes, a blacksmith who learned the difference between noise and song, a town that chose decency not as a pose, but as a habit. The council still met on Thursdays. The town still practiced opinions on Wednesdays. But the sound changed. Less brass, more harmony. Fewer complaint letters, more names on the school board and the wood delivery rota. When people argued, it was over how much flour the fund should issue, not whether flour was owed. When Agnes pinned a notice, it read, "Relief meets at dusk. Bring blankets. Bring news. Leave pride." She signed it A. Mercer, and for once no one muttered. One quiet evening after the anvil cooled, I pulled out the scrap of paper where Clara had first written the columns that unbent our town. The ink had faded. The numbers still stood. I tucked it into the Bible under Psalms because the language matched lament, ending in praise, righteousness measured in grocery lists and coal deliveries. Clara found me there and smiled without asking what I was hiding. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'll try the older boys on long division." "Long division," I said, "made this place." "Then they'd better learn it," she answered, and blew out the lamp. Morning returned like it never left, soft and sure. I put on the coffee. Upstairs, Lily sang scales only she knew. Tom negotiated with his socks. Greywater Crossing stretched, yawned, and decided to be decent again for one more day. And I, who used to measure a town by the sound of hammers, learned to measure it by the space it made for a woman to stand and tell the truth and be believed. That's a currency no ledger can cheat, and a debt no man should want to collect. Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. Your body will thank you. The turn. Spring edged into the valley like a cautious guest who had heard stories about us. The wind softened its teeth. The creek, once sullen and locked, began to move again, shrugging off its ice in slow sheets that caught the sun like broken glass. The road that ran past my forge seemed to take a breath. It no longer groaned when the wagons rolled, but hummed, as if glad to feel hooves again instead of silence. Greywater Crossing thawed the way people do, unevenly, stubbornly, one heart at a time. The snow retreated into gullies, the earth showing its bruises where it had been trampled all winter. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys just for heat, but for baking bread, not survival. Somewhere between the ice leaving the river and the first dandelions breaking the frost, the town learned to laugh again. "Well worked." I at the anvil, where the fire had moods like an old friend. Clara at the books, bent over neat columns of numbers that made sense in a way the world rarely did. By afternoon, she moved from ledgers to lessons. We'd set a school table by the forge window where the light was kindest. Kids came in 2s and 3s, miners' sons, drovers' daughters, faces like question marks turned upright by curiosity. They traced letters on slates while the sound of my hammer gave rhythm to their learning. Clara would pause sometimes to correct a child's hand, her own fingers smudged with chalk dust and grace. Watching her teach felt like watching someone plant fence posts no wind could steal. Sometimes I'd stop my hammer mid-swing just to listen, her voice steady and low, the children repeating after her, the anvil breathing in between like a metronome of faith. It made a man believe civilization wasn't a lie after all, just a quiet woman with a slate and some courage. We kept a ledger for kindnesses beside the iron one. If a man helped stack cordwood, a hinge found its way to his door. If a widow watched the twins for an hour so Clara could square the month, her kettle suddenly remembered how to hold a boil. I took my payment in stories and found I did not go broke. On a Tuesday, when the sky was clear enough to show its ribs, the city men returned. No Mercer with them this time. Their coats had lost their shine, dusted now with honest road grime. Their boots were scuffed, their arrogance chafed down by travel and consequence. One carried the same briefcase that had once held my eviction notice. It looked lighter. "We are withdrawing our claims," he said. "For now." "For good," I replied, "or you'll know the road better than you do now." They looked at each other, weighing how much pride they could afford. Finally, the tall one tipped his hat. "As you say, Mr. Rourke." They went. Not far, not fast, but gone enough for the air to breathe again. Sometimes victory is nothing more than the sound of footsteps leaving and the faint smell of fear behind them. That evening, Clara set Lily and Tom to sleep in the crib by the forge door. The twins liked to hear the anvil's sigh as it cooled, the way some children like lullabies. The forge's dying heat painted their faces gold. They dreamed in that glow like small prophets. We sat nearby with coffee that tasted faintly of regret and wood smoke. The lamp swung a little from the breeze, sneaking under the eaves. We didn't talk much at first. Words felt too loud for what was happening. Then she asked, "Do you ever think of what comes next?" "Next? When the work changes its name," she said, tracing the rim of her cup. "When it stops being survival and starts being something else." "Family?" I asked, too rough. She smiled. "That's a good word for it." "Oh." I cleared my throat. "If you stayed." "I am staying," she said, neat as a ledger entry. I started, but my mouth lost its discipline. She spared me. "I know what you meant." Her smile was small and private, the kind a woman gives when she's not just forgiving you but joining you halfway across a bridge you didn't know she'd already built. Outside, the creek kept whispering to the stones that winter was gone. Inside, the silence between us turned warm enough to touch. The next morning I found her sketching with chalk on the floorboards by the school table, drawing rectangles to stand for desks we didn't yet own. "They'll need a place to belong," she said. "Chairs tell a child the world can hold them." "Chairs," I said, "and a stove that doesn't smoke like a gambler." "We'll fix both," she said, and because she said we, the work was already half done. The next week brought a different kind of weather. A drifter rode in from the south, hat smart, eyes stupid. He smelled of sweat and luck gone bad. By evening he'd tried to pull Ella's day money from her till. I put him through the door, the fast way wood splintered, his pride with it. The sheriff arrived, wearing the expression of a man whose job was mostly disappointment. He hauled the drifter to the lockup, grunted thanks at me with the grace of a bear forced to curtsy. Clara patched the drifter's scalp anyway. "We don't leave anyone bleeding in gray water," she said, binding the bandage tight while the man winced and muttered about women who didn't know their place. "Lucky for you," she replied. "I do know mine. It's here." That night we laughed too hard at nothing and everything. The kind of laughter that feels like an exhale after too many held breaths. I laughed until my ribs ached, and she laughed until Lily woke and, in protest, threw her small fist in the air like a tiny monarch declaring martial law. "Guests in her kingdom," Clara whispered, rocking the child back to sleep. "We'd best behave." Then I'm doomed, I said. She smiled without looking up, and that smile stayed with me longer than sleep did. 2 days later, a letter came from Pittsburgh. The envelope bore the kind of handwriting that smells of ink and indifference. Clara read it at the table while the kettle hissed behind her. Her old landlord had sold what little she'd left behind: her mother's comb, a book of psalms, a shawl she'd worn the day she boarded the train west. For back rent, he'd written, neat as a noose. She read the letter once, folded it, and didn't cry. Just looked out the window at the mountains lifting their shoulders from snow. I carried too much East in my pockets, she said quietly. It's better this way. Things make ghosts, I told her. You already got enough of those. She nodded. But later I found the letter burned clean in the stove, ashes folded among the coals, like the final page of a story she'd chosen to stop reading. We started something new that spring, a cot by the forge for miners with crushed fingers and busted pride. Clara tended it with gentle hands and hard rules. Wash, she'd say. Sit. Speak when you remember how. Men who couldn't talk to their own hands learned to listen to her. I'd hammer at the anvil while she bound their wounds. The clang of iron and her calm voice made an odd duet: discipline and mercy, keeping time together. She kept vinegar steeping in a jar with sprigs of sage and a stubborn faith that cleanliness could borrow a little holiness. The men joked at first, then they healed faster and stopped joking. A man will convert to any gospel that takes away pain and gives him back his grip. Some nights, after the men had gone and the cot lay empty, I'd catch her staring at the bandages drying by the stove. You heal faster than they do, I said once. She looked up. I'm not sure that's true. It is, I said. You just heal in quieter places. She didn't answer, but the look she gave me was soft enough to bend steel. On Saturdays, we walked to the market stalls that sprouted at the edge of town like mushroom. Women bartered jars of peaches for needlework. Men compared boots and news. Clara taught Lily to point at turnips and say please like a prayer. Tom considered every dog a personal friend. I bought an old carpenter's square with a crack down the arm and fixed it for the joy of returning a thing to straight. Sunday came bright and too warm for coats. The church bell rang like it had been forgiven. Pike's sermon was about gratitude, though he delivered it with the enthusiasm of a man who preferred scolding. Afterward, when the benches creaked and the babies cooed, he cleared his throat. On behalf of folks who can count the times you've saved us, he said, we'd like to witness a small vow. He said my name. He said hers. The words hung there like sunrise caught in glass. The room tilted, faces swimming in blur. Lily gurgled from Clara's arms, as if she knew applause was expected. Clara looked at me startled first, then laughing, then luminous. I felt every heartbeat like a nail being driven in the right direction for once. And I did the bravest thing since the time I'd walked into a gun barrel in Amarillo and called it diplomacy. I took her hand. Not because the town needs quieted, I said. Not because papers need signed. Because I know what it is to be alone, and I am done with it if you are. I am, she said. Simple as water finding its level. The church exhaled. Someone clapped. Ella cried. Pike muttered something about miracles occurring without his permission. We didn't make a parade. We made a supper. Ella burned the biscuits out of nervous joy. Miller brought a river story that fit the day for once and didn't even cheat the ending. The sheriff, who feared emotion like gunpowder, mumbled something that might have been blessing. Mercer stayed away good. Some men bless a day more by absence. We ate stew thick with laughter and exhaustion. When the last bowl was scraped clean, I walked Clara home through a night that smelled of lilac and forge smoke. The lamp by our door flickered in the breeze. We stood there for a long time, not quite believing the world had let us arrive here alive. She said, "You sure this is what you want?" "I've been sure since the day you corrected my arithmetic." She laughed once, soft. "That was mercy, not math. Same thing, far as I can tell." I kissed her in the doorway. The twins, half asleep, kicked their feet in applause. The lamp guttered and steadied, as if the world itself had held its breath to watch. Somewhere down the street, a harmonica started playing. It wasn't in tune, but it was honest. Inside, the quiet felt different, like it had learned a new word. The next morning, the forge sounded changed. Same ring, same heat, Same tools hanging in their places, but the echo was fuller. The rhythm of hammer on anvil carried through the floorboards to where Clara was teaching the twins their letters. Every strike made Lily giggle, and Tom tried to mimic the sound with his spoon against the table. Clara called it music of labor. A man clocks his days in iron, but a family clocks them in smaller miracles. Laughter, scolding, the hush of shared prayer before supper, the holy chaos of babies who haven't learned to lie, the smell of soap mixed with coal smoke, the sight of laundry strung between rafters, the sound of someone humming while sweeping. These things became the hymn of the house. By midweek, Clara drew up a list on brown paper. Chalk, 2 more slates, 4 benches, latch for school door, stove pipe elbow. I added, hinges that don't bite children. She wrote a figure at the bottom, rounded it down in her mind, and smiled like $2 was a challenge she knew by first name. We went calling for donations the way the weather makes its own introduction. Agnes answered her door with a teacup and the expression of a woman perpetually disappointed in the century. Clara spoke first, clear, brief, not a plea so much as an invitation to belonging. Agnes examined the list, tightened her mouth, and fetched a little tin box. We left with 12 cents and a lecture about hem lengths. Clara thanked her as if we'd been blessed. Maybe we had. Next, Ella shoved a flour sack into Clara's arms. "Don't you open it till you're home," she said, and winked. Inside we found a rolled-up length of good muslin and 3 apples bribed from a freight man. Old Miller tore a page from his river journal and pressed a silver $50 through it. "For the door latch," he said, "so the wind doesn't get to class without knocking." Back at the forge, I planed pine boards into benches while Clara stitched a curtain for the school window. It had blue stitchwork like water. I forged a sign from flat stock and stamped the letters deep, Greywater School, mind your hands and heart. Clara declared it too sentimental. Then she kissed the heart and told me not to change a thing. A week later, the city men reappeared briefly with a new apology disguised as paperwork, withdrawal without prejudice. I folded it square and used it as a shim under the school stove until we could buy a sturdier leg. The law may not warm you, but it can keep a thing from wobbling. Trouble did not end with vows and benches. A boy tried to pocket Clara's pencil case and failed at both theft and shame. She caught him gently by the wrist, turned his hand palm up, and set the pencils back like returning bones to their right places. "You may borrow anything you can name," she told him. "Say the word for what you need, and it will arrive more honestly." He cried then, the kind of small cry that alarms no one and saves a life. That night, with the twins asleep and the forge cooling, I set a small square of coin silver on the anvil. I hammered slow, not to show off the metal but to teach my hands the word belonging. I made a narrow band, beveled the edges until it caught light like a brook, and stamped 2 letters inside. The first letters Lily and Tom could speak clean. When I slid it on Clara's finger the next morning by the stove, she didn't gasp or sermonize. She just closed her hand, then opened it again to pour coffee into my cup, and that's the closest thing to an oath I trust. Spring didn't stay forever. Seasons are honest like that. But before the grass went high and the river lost its shiver, we took the twins down to the shallows and let them stand where the water braided itself around their ankles. "We need a ritual," Clara said, "something that tells the future we intend to meet it." So we named the stones. Lily pointed at a round one, courage. Tom selected a flat one, patience. I picked one that fit my palm like an old tool, work. Clara chose 2 small ones, mercy and enough. We stacked them on the bank in a foolish little tower that lived 2 days before the current took its preferred liberties. The names remained, though, which is the point of names. When Pike came by that evening, he eyed the tower's remains and said, "The Lord loves cairns, even the failed ones." Then he sniffed the stew, declared it sanctified, and stayed for supper without being asked. Later, the circuit judge's rider clattered in with a blue paper envelope, the liens formally dismissed, the council's relief fund recognized, Mercer's late confession appended in clerk's hand. Clara read it at the table and set it down carefully, as if gratitude were fragile in spring light. "You kept your wire taut," she said. "We kept it," I answered, and for once I believed the plural pronoun was not ambition but inventory. In the evenings, When the forge cooled, we'd sit by the open door. The valley glowed amber, and the air tasted of dust and lilac. Sometimes Pike would wander by, hat in hand, pretending to look for theological advice. Ella brought pies she swore were edible this time. Even old Miller, half drunk on his own stories, would sit on the step and mumble about the river teaching him patience. And Clara, she'd smile at them all, one hand resting on Lily's curls, the other on Tom's small back, as if anchoring the world right where it belonged. I used to think peace was something you built with walls and locks. Turns out it's something that builds itself when you stop guarding the door. That night, as the fire dimmed to coals, Clara leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "We'll have to start saving. For schooling, for winter coats." "Whatever you say, Mrs. Rourke," I told her. She looked up, eyes bright, pretending to be scandalized. "You'll make the children think I'm respectable." "You already are," I said. "The rest of us are just trying to keep up." Lun. Outside, the wind sighed across the valley, no longer the sound of loneliness, but of everything alive answering everything else. Greywater Crossing slept easy that spring, and for the first time in years, I did too. Because the house I had once built of quiet had taken down its walls and decided, all on its own, to be a home. And if you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Wide country. Summer came on in a long, slow exhale. The ridgegrass turned the color of new coins, soft light moving through it like fingers counting what was still worth keeping. The air smelled of iron, bread, and dust, the holy trinity of any town that's learning to live right. We built a bench outside the forge for the old men to sit and tell lies in comfort. They came daily, creaking like porch hinges, carrying whittled canes and weather predictions that disagreed with the sky. One would talk about buffalo he never saw, another about a girl who'd once smiled at him in 1859 and ruined his life ever since. I kept the fire going and let them talk. Their voices were the sound of Greywater Crossing remembering itself. Clara's school table outgrew its corner and migrated to the church hall. What started with 3 children and 1 slate became a dozen, then 20. The laughter of students spilled into the street, filling spaces where sermons used to echo. She taught the letters as if they were seeds, A for apple, B for bread, C for courage, and watched them sprout into names, prayers, grocery lists. Sometimes I'd see her through the open window, the sun haloing her hair, and I'd think, that's what it looks like when God keeps a promise he forgot he made. Lily learned to clap on purpose. Tom learned to stand and then to negotiate with gravity, each fall met with applause. And I, who once measured the worth of a day and how straight a hinge could swing, learned that the sound of 3 breaths sleeping in the same room can mend a rib a man thought would always ache. Not every day was mercy. Life never lets you forget who's boss. A horse kicked Pike's nephew square in the leg one afternoon. Clara rode out with me, skirts tucked up, eyes all business. We set the bone right there in the pasture with Pike holding the boy and swearing through prayer. "Bones," Clara said, "are like people, they break from stubbornness and heal from obedience." The boy whimpered, then smiled, and she nodded like a general accepting surrender. A mine tunnel sloughed one evening, swallowing half a crew. We dug through the night, our lanterns shaking like hearts. Clara waited at the mouth, sleeves rolled, water boiling for when we dragged the men into mourning. 2 made it. 1 didn't. She washed the dirt from his face anyway. "Everyone deserves a clean meeting," she said, "even if it's not with us." And once after midnight, Silas Mercer staggered out behind his store. His coat was too fine for the hour, his breath loud enough to count. He found me locking up the forge. For a while we just stood there under the quiet stars, 2 men who'd spent too long pretending decency was a business. "Tell me," he said finally, voice cracked like parchment, "does forgiveness come with receipts?" "Not the kind you can file," I said. He nodded, eyes glassy. Didn't say sorry, but he didn't need to. Some debts get paid by finally seeing your own reflection without blinking. He died 2 winters later, clean and sober, and left half his store profits to the school. The town didn't talk much about redemption, but sometimes it showed up anyway, quiet, as mercy. On Sundays, we took the twins to the river, the same river that had carried old Miller's stories and half our worries. The water was bright and rude, cold enough to remind you you're still alive. Lily slapped it with her palms, laughing as if she could command its course. Tom toddled in after her, mouth open, tasting sunlight. Clara's laughter learned a new color there, silver. Like fish flashing in current. She'd kneel in the shallows, skirt hem soaked, hair escaping its braid, and I'd think how no cathedral ever looked so much like faith. Sometimes she'd catch me watching her the way a hungry man looks at a house with light in it. She'd smile, that small, knowing smile, and say one word, yes. I'd answer nothing, and everything was answered. At night the river smell clung to us, damp and wild. I'd listen to the twins breathing, to Clara's heartbeat steady beside mine, and think, this is what survival sounds like when it finally gets to rest. One evening, after the forge cooled and the babies surrendered to sleep, I handed her a small wrapped bundle. Inside was a comb bone, plain, carved along the spine with a tiny river. For the one you lost, I said, meaning the comb taken by her landlord's greed, meaning more than that. And for the one you found, she touched it like prayer. I thought I'd close that door. You did, I said, but we can hang something on the outside of it now. She looked at me for a long time, eyes full of all the roads she'd walked alone. Then she kissed me with that soft ferocity I've come to trust more than I trust my own iron. The forge still held its warmth, and for a moment the whole town, the canyon, the years themselves leaned close, as if to hear us breathe. Outside, the night was full of crickets sawing their little fiddles, the sound of the earth reminding itself to keep turning. I used to believe work was what made a man worth his name. Now I know it's who you build the quiet with after the work is done. Midway through that summer chapter, I feel like speaking plain to whoever's out there by lamplight or the small blue glow of some far-off screen in a city I'll never see. If you've made it this far, you're a true friend of the last West town. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health, with a bit of mercy, and with one small stroke of luck that finds you before the hour's up. When it does, share it in the comments. Let the world know good things still happen when you keep listening for them. You ask what we are now. I say, stubborn, tender, loud at breakfast, quiet at dusk. The school pays small coins and large praise. The forge keeps us in coffee, nails, and just enough ambition to build another table. Clara hums when she works low, tuneless, perfect. I still wake sometimes with the old fever silence on my tongue, ghosts from the war or from the years after, but it dissolves in the sound of Tom bargaining with his boots or Lily declaring to the universe that she exists. Evening finds us on the bench by the forge. Pike drops by with questions nobody asked. Ella brings bread still warm. Old Miller recites half a psalm and half a river story. Both end with the same moral, keep going. And we do. Come fall, we plan to travel, take the wagon up to Elk Ridge, where the aspen turns a gold you can hear. The air up there is thin, honest. I'll show Clara the place where I once decided not to keep living the same hour again and again. A ridge above the river, a gun beside me, dawn coming like a question I didn't know how to answer. I want her to see it, to know where the story bent toward her. She'll show me how to point our lives at something bigger than surviving. Maybe we'll plant a marker there, not a grave, but a beginning. Maybe we'll sit until the light slides away and the twins fall asleep in her lap, and I'll know that even the lost hours weren't wasted, they were just waiting for this view. We're not perfect. I still flare when a man lies neat. She still folds into herself when a woman in lace looks down her nose. We both stumble over the ghosts of our old selves, but we come back to the table, to the bench, to the small forgiving space between apology and forgiveness. We come back to the children's laughter, to the forge's steady pulse, to the soft place where our hands meet after the day's noise. Home isn't something you build once. It's something you keep rebuilding every evening. I don't know where the road takes a family like ours in a country this wide, but I know how it feels to ride into light with someone beside you who isn't afraid of the shadows you drag. If there's such a thing as frontier grace, that's it. Cowboy love stories worth the ink always end on a ridge, reins loose, sun setting behind you, the land opening like a promise. This one's no different. though we started where stories usually quit. We began in a wind that cut, in a silence that dared me to keep standing. She found me there, and I found her refusal to bow. If anyone asks what kind of tale this is, tell them it's a Wild West love story that forgot the rules. It's a mending, done slow and true, with fire and water, iron and patience, hands that don't let go, just because winter says so. Before I end, I'll say this for whoever needs hearing it. Today's story is about pain that looked like it had no way out until a small light changed everything. If you still believe that even in your darkest hours, there's a miracle waiting down the road. If you trust that maybe, just maybe, God is watching from the ridgeline, quietly arranging the next turn in your favor, then type AMEN wherever you are. Because who knows, at the moment you write it, a blessing might already be making its way toward you across some wide, dusty country. And if it is, I hope it finds you the way summer found us, slow, certain, and full of light. The summer deepened and learned our names. Heat stacked in the alleys. Thunderheads built themselves like bad ideas beyond Alder Pass. The bench outside the forge gathered stories the way cotton gathers burrs. I started stamping small horseshoes with initials for the schoolchildren and nailing them to the back wall, their first letter in iron. Clara said it was foolishness. Then she traced her finger over Lily's and didn't say it again. We got a piano of sorts. It arrived in town on a freight wagon with a cracked soundboard and strings that had learned a few too many winters. The driver said it had no buyers and no business surviving the road. Pike bought it anyway with $3 and a sermon IOU, and we rolled it into the church hall. It took 6 men and 2 opinions. The first time Clara laid her hands on its keys, a broken hymn fell out that made even the dust listen. She didn't know the tunes proper, so she made up her own. Children sang Crooked and Happy. Ella wept like it was a birth. News takes the stage when music's in town. Agnes came in late, feathers bristling, and stood at the door like the idea of joy owed her money. I braced for a scold, but Agnes surprised me. She waited until the children finished "Holy, Holy" in a key God didn't authorize. Then she stepped forward, stiff as a ledger, and placed a small sack of coins on Clara's desk. "For chalk," she said, "and for a door latch that doesn't bite." Clara thanked her without frosting the words, and Agnes nodded once, as if she'd passed a private test. She still twexed at the twins' bare feet, but did it softer, like nostalgia was making room beside propriety. We had a dust devil wander down the main street one afternoon, tall as gossip and twice as quick. It lifted Tom's hat clear off and carried it half a block before setting it gentle on old Miller's head. The town laughed, and Miller claimed the wind owed him interest. Lily declared herself Queen of Wind Hats, which was not a position on any council agenda, and somehow that made it official. Trouble, when it came, did not announce itself politely. It arrived on a Tuesday with 3 riders from the north, trail-worn and hot-eyed, looking to turn their tempers into someone else's problem. They shouldered into Ella's place and demanded whiskey Ella didn't sell, then knocked over 2 chairs, proving a point no one wanted to learn. The sheriff was up country on a prisoner fetch, which left the deputy a man shaped like a broom handle and as assertive to do the honors. He tried. The riders laughed. They had the look of men who'd been told no too few times. I walked in with my sleeves rolled and my patience unbuttoned. Clara was already there because she goes where the noise is and refuses to call it bravery. She stood with her hands flat on the counter, not afraid, just unwilling to flee. The tallest rider flicked his glance her way and grinned a kind of grin that insults his own mother. "Sir," I said, and he looked at me like I had applied for employment as a floorboard. "What?" he asked, generous. "You're going to pick up those chairs," I said. "Thank Ella for the lemonade, apologize to the deputy for making him sweat, and ride out like men who remember they had mothers." He scratched his jaw as if courage itched. Or I will show you the one part of town that doesn't mind blood." He laughed high and easy, and his hand went nowhere near his holster because he wanted to prove something. He lifted his glass to drink what wasn't whiskey. I took 3 steps and sent him through the door with the old shoulder and a lesson about hinges. The second rider found the deputy's courage on the floor and sat down to talk to it. The third decided his horse needed him urgently. We swept up the broken and let the afternoon cool down hot tempers. Clara bandaged a knuckle and a pride. When it was done, Ella handed me a slice of pie the size of consequence and said nothing, which was thank you, and don't you ever do that again in one serving. That night we sat on the bench, calm as if calm had been earned. You frighten me when you're calm, Clara said. I was furious, I said. That's what I mean. The storm finally broke 2 nights later, throwing spears of rain so hard the ground complained. Lightning reached down and scolded the hills. I stood under the eave, counting seconds, a boy again measuring distance by thunder. Clara carried Lily and Tom to the doorway to show them brave light. Lily clapped in awful timing. Tom stared with solemn approval, already an old man in a small body. When the rain slowed, a smell lifted from the dirt like apology. The air felt taller. The creek swelled and cursed every rock that had doubted it in June. We slept cold and deeply that night, the kind of sleep that rinses a man's bones. Morning brought the accident we'd been warned about and ignored. Lily, queen and tyrant, ran down the bank before my voice could rope her. She stepped on river-slick truth and slid. I saw her small body tilt and heard a sound I'll hear at the last, water deciding to keep what it had borrowed. I hit the bank on a running prayer. Clara was faster. She went in up to her waist without negotiation, one hand grabbing a root, the other closing around Lily's dress with the authority of a mother who has wrestled worse things. I came in from the side and got under. The river tried to bargain we brought more muscle and refused to parley. We hauled our girl out coughing and furious at the river's audacity. Tom cried in sympathy like a man tithing. Back on the grass, Clara held Lily so tight the child complained, which is how you know the world is right again. I had my forehead on the earth, and did not pray so much as say thank you to whatever keeps a father from breaking in half. Later, when the twins slept warm, and none the wiser, Clara looked at me and said, I did not panic. It sounded like surprise and vow. You were impossible, I said. Good, she answered. Then we match. That night I went to the forge after they slept. I took down a strip of coin silver I'd tucked away for a day that looked like this one. I forged a narrow band while the town breathed slow. I hammered the edge just enough to catch light, like a river when it behaves. Inside I struck 2 letters and a date that only we knew. It wasn't a ring in the way the world uses rings, it was a circle that reminded me to keep choosing, especially when fear shouts and all the old silences try to crawl back into my mouth. I gave it to her in the morning as if it were nothing. She turned it in her palm and understood. There was no speech. She slid it on her finger and kissed my scraped knuckles, which healed something in me that medicine never found. August showed up with a county picnic and bees that loved lemonade more than people do. We took blankets and fried chicken and Ella's reckless pies. Children ran indignantly. The men argued weather futures and cattle options and which hymn doesn't shout. Agnes organized a spelling match with military precision. She pinned a number to Clara's shoulder and one to mine and told us with a smile, not smile, that the town expected excellence. I spelled farrier without flinching. Clara spelled psalmody as if the letters had asked to be put in order. Old Miller spelled river 3 ways and insisted he had regional dialects to justify his invention. Pike awarded him an honorable mention for theological creativity. When the sun tilted, we sang the songs everybody knows some about heaven. One about drinking we pretended not to know, and 2 so old the dust hummed along. Clara's voice sat inside mine like a bird in a safe tree. The twins fell asleep on one blanket, too full of summer to hold more. We watched the light pull long threads across the grass, weaving day to its ending. I wanted to say something big, and instead said nothing, which is sometimes how men learn to mean it. Work does not forget a town just because it has had a picnic. A freight wagon snapped an axle on the slope into Greywater, and the driver limped his team into the yard, cussing in a language that was mostly vowels and regret. We propped the wagon, lifted the load with 4 men and 2 prayers, and I went at the axle with stubbornness. The iron had been poured thin. I told it what kind of town it had arrived in and asked it to try again. It did. The driver paid in coffee and a tiny sack of tobacco. We took the coffee. Pike confiscated the tobacco for the school science experiments. He said, Combustion should be supervised. 3 weeks later, the circuit judge came through with 2 deputies and a hat that believed in its own authority. He held our counsel to account, sorted Mercer's ledgers with a patience that suggested he had been a schoolteacher before the law found him, and signed 3 papers that made the town feel taller. He shook Clara's hand, thanked her for her arithmetic, and told me to keep the forge doors open on windy nights, because a town needs to hear where its heat comes from. I liked him more after that. We baptized the twins at the river not long after Pike argued for the horse trough to prevent backsliders and rocks, but the water insisted on itself. Clara wore a blue dress that forgave the dust. I wore my best shirt, which is to say it had fewer burns than usual. The town showed up with sandwiches, songs, and a thin fear of emotion. Agnes brought 2 tiny crocheted caps and set them on the blanket with a throat clearing that meant generosity without testimony. Pike raised his hands. "We mark what's already true," he said. "Water doesn't make them loved. It reminds us to act like it." "He dipped," they yelled. Everyone cried. Ella waved a kerchief the color of tomatoes. Old Miller declared the river behaved properly today and that he took partial credit. After, we ate too much and forgave ourselves for it. The twins slept in new caps. Clara leaned against me under a cottonwood and whispered, "I didn't think this was allowed." Lash. "What?" "Being held by more than one pair of hands." "It is here," I said. "We'll make sure of it." The last heat of summer came like a warning that the world remembers to change. Grass crisped to the color of old letters. The creek lowered its voice. Night started asking for blankets again. I found myself counting nails and days and not minding that both ran out eventually because both pointed to something real. A letter arrived with no return name and neat corners. Inside were 5 $1 notes and a sentence. "For the school window, from a man who saw his reflection and did not look away." We did not say Mercer's name, but we said a prayer for him anyway, which is how you honor the dead and the living in one breath. One afternoon, Clara came home with bruised knuckles and triumph on her mouth. "What war?" I asked, reaching gently for her hand. "A quarrel with a mother who thought reading dangerous. We compromised." She grinned. "Her boy will read when he's done with chores, and she will learn her letters beside him so the devil doesn't get an advantage." "You scare me when you negotiate," I said. "I'm delightful," she said, and kissed me to prove the point. The day finally came to climb Elk Ridge. We loaded the wagon with bread, blankets, coffee, and the kind of hope you don't say out loud. The aspens met us with coins for leaves and a rumor of wind on their bark. Every step up the grade felt like we were leaving a version of ourselves at the switchbacks. We reached the place where I had once sat with a gun in a morning I didn't want. The ridge looked smaller now, not because it had shrunk, but because I had. I stood where I had stood. Clara stood beside me where no one had been before. The river far below threaded silver through a green so deep it argued for belief. I said nothing at first. The twins slept on the blanket like 2 commas in a long sentence. The sky wore blue like a cleaned plate. I pointed to a rock where I'd rested the barrel, to a notch in a cedar where I'd written a name I hadn't spoken aloud since. The wind read it for us and let it go. "I didn't," I said. "I didn't do it because a crow landed too close and scared me, and the stupid world laughed, and I got mad enough to live 1 hour more so I could spite it. I kept doing that until I got to you." Clara took my hand. "Thank the crow," she said softly. "I have," I said. "Every time I see one sit like a judge." She opened the small satchel and took out the comb I'd carved. She pressed it into the dirt at the ridge's edge, so the river's tiny engraving faced the water. "Not a grave," she said. "A marker." We sat until the light slid away and the twins woke, and did not cry because the world was too large to waste on sadness. We drank coffee that had no business tasting good and laughed at nothing we could explain. On the way down, the aspens whispered secrets to each other with their pale scars. I believed everyone. We came home to a town that had kept itself. The bench was where we left it. The forge had behaved. The church house had not burned down nor converted itself into a saloon despite rumors. That night the stars felt close enough to borrow. In the days that followed, we built small things that stay. I forged a hinge for a widow's pantry door that had squeaked like a conscience for a year. Clara stitched a quilt from pieces the town had brought flour sack, a bit of Agnes's lace, an old shirt of mine that had lost a fight with a cylinder rod. The quilt looked like a map of where we had been too stubborn to quit. We hosted a